Good evening. You're on the smoking section. My name is Stephen Helfer, and I represent Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, who try to add some clarity and fairness to this anti-smoking war, which has been going on now in the United States and elsewhere for about, I would say, about 50 years almost. Probably, but at least in my uh, perception, it really didn't start till the early 80s, and I don't know why it got so powerful then, except possibly because of, partially at least, from a Surgeon General by the name of C. Everett Koop, who was a fanatic anti-smoker, and there had been Surgeon Generals before him, but he was probably the first to become a real activist, and I think also prior to 1980, the idea of secondhand smoke was really unheard of. Nobody talked about secondhand smoke. Nobody, very, very few people were bothered by secondhand smoke, and certainly no one attached any kind of great health consequence to that. And somehow, and I don't know exactly how, um, that really gave the anti-smoking movement legs, if you will, because from that point on, uh, the anti-smokers in society could say, well, we don't mind you smoking yourself, but your smoke is harming others and is harming us. And so that really began the avalanche of restrictions and whatnot, and the antipathy towards smokers. Although the antipathy they had been drumming it up beforehand. I mean, I remember seeing in the sometime in the late 70s, I think, or maybe even the early 70s, that the American Cancer Society, their strategy was to somehow isolate and alienate smokers in our society. And by doing that, they would so punish and so marginalize smokers that either they would give up the habit and other people would not want to start. And but with the secondhand smoke idea, that concept, that gave them a lot of power. And I think that really wasn't around. The secondhand smoke wasn't really around in the 80s very strong because, for example, I remember in 1985, which is 33 years ago, uh, studying at Harvard and smoking in the library and uh, in the reading room of Widener Library. And the room was divided in half. Half was for smokers, half was for non-smokers. And there were plenty of non-smokers who chose to come in that very, very large, high-ceilinged room. But they also had many other places to go. So it wasn't as if they were forced to be exposed to other people's smoke. They didn't mind it, and there was no coughing in the room. People were not complaining that their eyes bothered them. They weren't complaining that their clothes smelled of smoke. Uh, those things all came about gradually, and those things gave the kind of weaponry to really, really restrict and regulate smokers and smoking. Uh, as Michael McFadden, whom I refer to, also points out, one of the key or the linchpin of the secondhand smoke theory was in 1992 when the EPA did a meta-analysis of all of the studies on secondhand smoke. And even though the APA did a tremendously biased report, which was thrown out by a federal judge at one point, it was able to really give a lot of power to that. Although, as McFadden points out, if you look at the actual risk that the EPA found for those people, for non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke for 20 or 30 or 40 years, the risk was really so small as to be what is called in the science of epidemiology statistically insignificant. It was so small that it really could have been a very due to random events and nothing like what the public was led to believe. And so then that is where the real strength of the anti-smoking movement does come from, is this secondhand smoke thing. Of course, also the anti-smokers like to say that smokers, because they get sick, end up costing the government money in terms of medical expenses that the government underwrites. But of course, that on the face is really disputable, because at the same time they claim smokers die very much younger than non-smokers, so that if smokers die younger, they collect less Medicare, less Social Security, less annuities, and all of those kinds of private things. And then if you add into that smokers pay taxes that non-smokers don't, which are now becoming a very substantial part of the budgets of many states, you have the idea that smokers end up costing other people money is really bogus. And in fact, in point of fact, certainly here in Massachusetts, I would say that smokers are actually subsidizing non-smokers. And the same in New York State or New York City. And the idea of these kinds of targeted taxes that hit one group of people, one would think would be anathema to the American public, because we have an ethos, we are supposed to have an ethos where everybody pitches in and shares for all these government programs. But in the cases of tobacco taxes, they are very popular because most people pay them, so they're passing off the expense on the other guy, to wit, people who smoke. Now today, one of our members of Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, Jonathan Bowen Leopold, pointed out that there was a kind of a national, I think it might have been a national Talk with a Cop Day. And he pointed that out to me. So here in Cambridge, I was able to go to a Starbucks and meet what turned out to be about 6 members of the Cambridge Police Department, and including the commissioner of the police department, whose name is, I think, Granville Bard. His last name is Bard, and I think his first name is Granville, which is, of course, an unusual name. But I was able to share with them some of the concerns of smokers, particularly how it relates to lower income smokers and smokers with mental disabilities, and explain to them the very egregious tax policies and how the restrictions actually are very difficult for police departments to manage. But fortunately here in Cambridge, we really don't have very many outdoor restrictions on smoking, so it really is not that what should I say, that much of a burden on the police. Unfortunately, people in bars and restaurants tend to comply, which I think is a really bad sign, a sign that Americans are allowing themselves to be nanified and told what to do even in their smallest ways. This idea of freedom and liberty, which, I mean, supposedly Boston is the cradle of liberty, and Massachusetts is the cradle of liberty, and here we have all of these restrictions on our daily lives. So I was able to share with them that, and I was also able to, in 1987, the state of Massachusetts passed a law that no town or city could hire anybody in the police departments who uses tobacco either on or off the job. And I was able to query these policemen if they how this affected them. And by and large, when they are hired, if they've been hired since 1987, they do have to sign something, and that means if they are theoretically caught smoking a cigar or having a cigarette, even off duty, even in their own home, if someone notices that they're smoking, they are subject to discipline. And fortunately, from what I understand from a man named Rick Riley, who is the traffic commissioner here, or not the traffic commissioner, but the officer who is in charge of traffic and has been on the force for 26 years, there hasn't been an instance of any discipline in the Cambridge Police Department, which, and I know at least one officer who smokes on duty even, and that indicates happily to me that this is not something that the supervisors in the police department, at least here in Cambridge, are enforcing with too strong a hand. The hand of the nanny state, or the nurse ratchet state, as some people refer to it as. And I was also able to bring up the issue of our sidewalk butlers with a police officer named Billy Larmonica, difficult name, but his name is Larmonica, who is going to be in the unit that is in Central Square where we have positioned our butlers, and so he will be helping me, I hope, reposition them to make them more accessible. Well, just I want to see if we can get our Smoker of the Week without forgetting the Smoker of the Week, which I usually do. And let's see if I can pull this young woman up. Oh, here we go. There we go. Not too difficult. Let's see. And I hope you're bearing with me. And here we go. And I really like this photo. I think it's a very well done photo. And it shows how tobacco can comfort somebody even in a very, very distressed state. It can help the person cope. And unlike pharmaceutical drugs, which slow down your reflexes, which impair your judgment, make you unable to drive, tobacco can calm you, but at the same time increase your ability to drive a car or write or think and all of these things. And so I think this is a really good photo of Karen Sunderland. This is from the New York Times in 2002, and she had just heard something very shocking and, of course, distressing, that her father had been convicted of a 1963 bombing in an Alabama church. Of course, a very heinous crime, and presumably he was rightfully convicted. But of course, a daughter cannot be happy when she hears that about her father, probably something she never knew and perhaps didn't believe. And of course, perhaps he was wrongfully convicted. Who knows? But here is Karen Sunderland deriving comfort from a cigarette that, at least in 2002, in Alabama was probably very, very cheap, certainly a lot cheaper than pharmaceuticals, etc. Um, Now, we have before discussed a study that was done by a doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital by the name of Winikoff. And it was a very, very misleading study because he did a survey and he asked people if they believed that the residue of cigarette smoke, which is left on furniture, of course, something you can hardly see, can build up over years, but could be harmful, particularly to children. And many people, and if the person surveyed believed that it was, did the person ban smoking in his or her house? And of course, not surprisingly, if someone believed that this residue could be harmful, certainly they would be someone who would be very, very concerned about smoke and smoking, and they would ban smoking. But the way this was presented in the press was that, oh my gosh, third-hand smoke is dangerous. Now we have not only second-hand smoke, but third-hand smoke is dangerous. And one of the elements that they talked about in third-hand smoke was a radioactive element, or I think isotope you call it, polonium-210. And of course, what they don't mention is that polonium-210 is something that is found throughout the environment, at least according to Canadian government and the U.S. government. It is something that one gets in food, one gets in water, one gets in air, and naturally, if one would get it in all of these things, one would also get it in tobacco. But at the time, of course, they only mentioned that you got it in tobacco, and again, my colleague, I would say, in the smokers' rights field, Michael McFadden, did a kind of real careful analysis because this was just prior to the time where someone, I think it was a Russian dissident, was killed with polonium-210. But of course, the dose one gets in one's food or the air or water or tobacco or cigarettes is minuscule. But this was used as another way to kind of scare tactics on people who were smoking and on third-hand smoke and all of that kind of thing. And I was kind of hoping that Michael might call this evening and go through, because it's quite complex how radioactive isotopes are measured, and the measurements are something that go millicuries and nanocuries and very, very tiny increments. But McFadden was able to show that if the polonium in third-hand smoke was at all dangerous, it would have to be, one would have to be exposed to it over hundreds of years. So totally impossible. But this is again what is often used by anti-smokers, is they don't mention the most fundamental law in toxicology, is that the dose makes the poison. So if something is in a small enough dose, it is harmless, and if it's in a large enough dose, it can be lethal. So as we all know, water in a large enough quantity can kill, as it has There are many instances of people who have drank too much water and thinking that it was doing them good, and they drank so much, are in an example of hazing, college hazing. At least one person who drank so much water died. So yes, polonium-210 can kill, but the doses one gets in smoke or secondhand smoke or third-hand smoke are so negligible that they could not hurt anybody, a child or an adult. And that was something that I had hoped between last week and this week to really get down, but I never did. I looked at it again. I looked at Michael's very interesting analysis, and particularly a discussion he had with some anti-smoker on some website where this article was posted, and it was a very, very interesting discussion, far-reaching. It's very nice sometimes to see a dispassionate discussion of facts rather than a passionate discussion where people impugn each other's motives and use all kinds of profanities and use ad hominem attacks, which, of course, on the internet seems to have been unleashed. And, of course, here in Cambridge seems to be very prevalent. Everybody hates the Donald Trump, and they hate Kavanaugh, and a lot of hatred flying around. I don't think it's a very healthy. I think it's far more destructive than smoking could ever be. And it was a very good discussion. Well, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights did mount a campaign against the FDA's idea to eliminate almost all the nicotine in cigarettes. According to the FDA, Scott Gottlieb, the director, an appointee of Donald Trump, and some people hope that because Donald Trump was less, let's say, meddlesome perhaps than certain other presidents, that he might have a director of the FDA who is not so hard on us smokers. But unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be the case. Not only is Gottlieb going after cigarette smokers, he's going after cigar smokers. And the idea of eliminating nicotine from cigarettes and according to the FDA, this would be to assist smokers who want to quit and prevent other people from starting. But the whole idea that nicotine is addictive is actually not really very well based on evidence. For example, researchers have never been able to get animals addicted to nicotine, number one. Number two, the FDA itself says that nicotine-containing pharmaceuticals, which are used to quit smoking, are non-addictive. There's no danger of dependence, even though they contain nicotine, which is supposedly very addictive. And three, millions upon millions of Americans have quit smoking, and when they quit, other than a couple of days of irritability and difficulty concentrating, they suffer no withdrawals, certainly nothing like alcohol or opioids or the like. So is nicotine addictive? I would say not. Thank you for watching the smoking section. Please watch next